Well, I want to welcome to you to Answers for Today. We're actually back in studio. I'm here. Chris is in Texas. We're glad to be back, bringing to you some fresh live programs as we somewhat start our late summer, early fall season on Answers for Today. Here to answer your questions with a biblical perspective. And so, like every week, I want to welcome Chris. And Chris is our I would say, our Israeli news reporter per se. He can give us some update what's going on in the land. And Chris, if I'm not mistaken, you're taking another trip next year again. And so, anything that we should be aware of that's going on in Israel even this day, Chris?
Interestingly enough, and there's a bit of an angle that's also going on because of our country as well. But as you know, there's been some hostility that you have that's been going on there. It was in the news within the last couple of weeks in a place known as Jenin, and Israel had to go in mainly because of there are a few places that you can find in what is known as the West Bank that is a kind of an operational territory for terrorists, and it had finally gotten to the place for a couple of reasons: the uptick in the attacks that had been happening, or the violence that had been shown towards Israel. And they knew where it was coming from. They had intelligence for it, so there was an operation to go and to take care of it. And of course, what it did in this country is it raised up the likely suspects in our Congress, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and I think her name is Jayapal, the congresswoman from, I think, up in the Washington area, maybe Oregon. But anyhow, it was the same group of people. They're calling the Israelis racist, and there's the same nonsense that we always hear about genocide and all the foolish things that we hear from people who don't understand. So there's always that external pressure from outside the country, and we have some in our own government that are pulling that nonsense. And then there is the internal threat that they have from within their borders, and it just kind of ramps up, and it gets a lot of rhetorical stuff being said. But there is really genuine times when Israel needs to do this for their own defense. So those things have been going on. There's still plenty on the political side. We just see this. You and I, as Bible teachers, would look at this and say, I expect there to always be something going on that is attempting to undermine the well-being of Israel because of who they are in God's perspective and what we know is still future to their time. So the idea that there is always something that you can point to and saying, boy, the distress that goes on there doesn't affect our trips. I mean, we go there anyhow. About the only thing that could change us going on our trips is if government starts to interfere with passports and vaccinations and digital, the way of getting from place to place. That would end up bringing a halt to our trips, but very seldom do we have to worry about security concerns.
Chris, I think it's interesting when you bring up this idea of racism. When I've been over there, I could walk around any place I want to do, both Arab and Jewish areas. They always treat the tourists really well, treat us. And is there frictions? Absolutely. There's been frictions between them for my goodness, since 4,000 years, right? And it continues this day with the battle over the land. But some political people try to make their statement by just throw out a big word, racism. But when you go over there and you look people in the eyes, my goodness, I'm always felt at peace being walking around on that properties, over the land over there. I feel welcome. They always want to give me food to eat and everything else. It doesn't matter, And so we make something that's so big, it's unbelievable. But yet, even in saying that, though, I do know that there's going to be something that's going to spark really, I think, a major conflict coming up soon, rather than further down the road. We see it in an Ezekiel scenario. There is that animosity between the Arabs and Jews and who has the right to the land. And that goes back from the forefathers to the forefathers to the forefathers. That goes a long time, and it's kind of like it's building up, isn't it?
Sure, that's a Jacob and Esau thing.
Yes.
So you can point it back that far if you want to, but you and I would look at this and say, I believe at any given time you have something taking place in the land that if it was allowed to escalate, it could very well start the whole thing that you had just mentioned with Ezekiel, and really what would trigger kind of the ramp up of the end times, and really kind of the where it gets to the judgment, where we start talking Book of Revelation, tribulation, rapture of the church, that kind of stuff. And really, again, as Bible teachers, we would say, well, God's the one who says at whatever that particular time is, I'm going to use this that's going on currently as the impetus for what they're going to do. And it'll just start the whole process. That's why I never really fret much over what could potentially be happening today or tomorrow. I just have to say, at some point, God will say, I'm no longer going to prevent it from escalating. So that's why trying to predict what will be the precursor to it, or really, I should say, the trigger for it is a better way. I don't even try to speculate at that anymore, because
No,
it just
no.
comes and goes.
Well, it does, but the fact is that we know what the scripture says it will happen, and that's what we got to rely on. Let me throw out a point for our audience, Chris, and maybe you can elaborate on it. There was a prophet, his name was Jeremiah, right around, I'm going to guess right now, I don't have my notes in front of me, Jeremiah chapter 24, 25, where he made this amazing, really prediction, prophecy that the nation had been in rebellion, if you remember your story there. And God had really moved them over to a place where they were to be taken into Babylon, and it tells us for 70 years. And the 70 years, to make a long story short, is the reason why that was 70 years. Remember when they came into the land, they were told to, plow the fields for 6 years. The land's going to be really good, but on the seventh year, let it rest. Let it have a chance to revitalize itself and then start growing crops again. Well, they never did that, and they never gave it what is known as a Sabbath rest to the land. And so 490 years had gone by, and so the Lord says, I'm going to take my Sabbath rest, so you're to go in captivity for 70 years. So Jeremiah says that, Chris, and then lo and behold, this older fella, he sends this letter out there, and his name was Daniel. He got older in his life, and he started reading this letter, and he started realizing the 70 years are about up. What a story of Bible prophecy, how the prophet spoke it, give it some time, and it came to pass, right? Isn't that what we're saying about the return of Jesus Christ? Very similar, that the Bible prophecy will come to pass.
Absolutely. And you've given a great explanation of one of those two very, very prominent 490-year prophecies. And the one is, we're still in the middle of one of them, but the 490 years that they did not give the land rest, that's the reason. Those 70 cycles of that seventh year was not seen to by them, and God said, I'm giving the land time out from you guys. So that they were taken away.
That's a good way to put it. Yes.
Yeah. So you get that information, chapters 29, 30, 31 of the regathering to them, and the promise that he would, even though they had not yet gone. But then you mentioned Daniel, and in his 9th chapter, he gives another 490-year prophecy, but with a twist on this one. And the first 483 of them were fulfilled from when Artaxerxes makes the proclamation through Nehemiah to go and rebuild the walls around the city.
So this is like at the end of the 70 years now in captivity. Now you're saying in Nehemiah, this king steps up and makes this proclamation then, right?
And ultimately, it was the 70 years really began with Zerubbabel and Cyrus. And it was much later down the road, almost 100 years later, where Nehemiah is able to go back under Artaxerxes. We see that in Nehemiah 2. And from that time that he gives that decree until Jesus comes into Jerusalem is 483 years. Daniel talks about there being 490, but 69 of those cycles of years has already taken place, and then Jesus comes and he's cut off. And then there's still another 7 years, which is what we know is the tribulation in the book of Revelation. There's just that split from the time Jesus came into Jerusalem until he will begin the process of what is known as the tribulation. We believe the church will be removed before that, and that last 7 year interval will take place. So there's those two 490-year prophecies that are given, and we've just covered both of them.
So Chris, with that, as we're starting to see it, and we can look back now and see how accurate the Bible is on these biblical prophecies. Where do we stand far as the calendar, as far as these? We know that Jesus Christ came in. He came the first time. But what about the signs of him coming the second time? Is there some things that we, as individuals, we should be looking for? I think it says that we should know the days and the hours. We should know the seasons, and yet, what would you say are a few benchmarks that Christians should be looking at?
Well, there's one benchmark that stands above all the rest of them, and that is the establishing of the state of Israel. And not just because of the passages that some people might point to, but just in the big picture, the events that the book of Revelation talks about refers to a Jewish people regathered to a place we know as Jerusalem and the land of Israel. Well, until they were actually occupying the land again and back in the place that God had given to them, I shouldn't even use the word occupation. They're back now and they are in the land that God had given to them, but they had been displaced for 1900 years. So now that we see them back in the place, you can say, fine, now the Jews are back in their allotted land that God gave them. Without that, you couldn't have the events that are spoken of in the book of Revelation and in the Old Testament prophets as well. So,
Well, Chris, it's also worthwhile, I think, to mention to everybody watching. You just said 1900 years or 5 generations of people living where the Jews were dispersed after 70 A.D. They weren't in the land. And this is the miracle that there has never been a people group really to maintain their identity more than 2 generations, and 5 generations had gone by, and now you see something really. You have to say nothing but a miracle that they came drawn back into the land from all over the world. What happened in 1948? There was almost something like I can imagine living at that time. Maybe in their hearts they say, "I have to go. I have to go back to Israel." There must have been something burning in their hearts for them to pick up from New York, from Russia, from South America, from all over the world to say, "We're going back to Israel." That must have been something, huh?
yeah, and of course we understand really, if we really understand what the text has to say, it's God who says, I'm going to be the one to regather them. So even if they say, we want to go back to the place of our sojourn and where our ancestors came from, God put that in them in the first place because he's the one who said he'd gather them back. When we talked a little bit earlier about that, the Jeremiah passages of 30 and 31, God refers to regathering his people, Israel and Judah. And it's a very careful wording that we should understand that by the time that Jeremiah was talking, Israel in the north is already gone. All that remained
they were
was
gone a
Judah.
long time ago.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So all that there is Judah. So when God says, I'm going to reestablish Israel and Judah back in the land, all you got to do is say, well, when did that happen historically? And from the time of the displacement that you mentioned at 70 AD at the hands of the Romans, there has never been a time that Israel and Judah, or the land as we understand it, is under the control of the Jewish people until modern times. It just has not occurred until modern times. So that's the fulfillment, and that is all part of what is necessary for there to be this possibility of them being gathered back in the land.
One of the main reasons why Chris and I love talking about Bible prophecy and on this program is to encourage you, because the evidence of the Bible being true is overwhelming. The prophecies of old and the ones that deal with our lives even this day and concerning our future. And we want you to grow in your faith. And if you choose not to believe in Jesus Christ, uh, the Bible actually tells you the reason why you reject Jesus Christ, because you love your darkness rather than the light, so you won't come to the light. And it's our prayer is that you would take some consideration, even right now. If you've been sitting on the fence, do you believe in Jesus? If you don't believe in Jesus, that you would examine the evidence and make a choice. Just call out upon the Lord right now and say yes to Jesus. And we would love to hear from you. Chris would love to hear from you, and I certainly would love to hear from you. We have much more on Bible prophecy that we'd love to share with you. Certainly go to Chris's website. It'll be up there at the end, and I'll put it there where you could follow along in these passages there. And I would encourage you to go through Ezekiel with Chris or any of the major prophets as he brings these to light, or else at Agape Chapel you can go verse by verse to be encouraged on those. Chris, but we wanted to talk a little bit about, we're to shift gears now, so we're to put on a different hat per se, and we want to go and take a look a little bit about some of these books that sometimes we miss the understanding of it, maybe help give you some foundations to the book, in particularly the book of James and Hebrews, and I thought we would introduce these books by allowing Chris to give you a little background of these books and the approach that we have it, so we can glean everything that we can as we study these books. Chris, why don't you put your professor hat on and give us a little background on these books?
Oh, yeah. Well, Terry, I know you're just as I am that these types of things are so intriguing to you. But if we're going to be a Bible teacher, then these are essential bits of information because it'll affect the way that they're presented. As you know, so often the churches, modern times, will read a passage out of the Bible, not even being concerned with the context or the audience or even the writer, and they just go right into it as though it was written for the 21st century person. They go immediately into the application, and so much of the information that should be there is lost to us. So the book of Hebrews, the book of James are both written very, very obviously to a Jewish audience, purely Jewish audience that are also believers. James makes that probably even as blatant as it could possibly be by identifying them, because he says that this is to the 12 tribes that are dispersed abroad and that have been scattered, basically, is what he is saying. And we know that that happened because of, in my estimation, it's not what happened at the hands of the Romans, but rather what happened after the resurrection of Jesus and the birth of the church. There was an incredible persecution that began to take place. Chapter 7 is the first of the martyrs of the church with Stephen. And you read in the first verses of chapter 8 that the persecution had become so fierce that all that really remained of the church at Jerusalem was the apostles, but everyone else scattered. So James writes this to a Jewish audience because there are examples that he's going to give that without a Jewish understanding of the scriptures and their responsibility to understand the law and what God would expect, even though they're New Testament believers nonetheless, he's trying to tell them they should do things and be reminded of things that they knew from the law that were still consistent even with a Christian belief. And so when you read it in that way, you're able to say, when we read this book, we're kind of flies on the wall, if you will, and we're reading a book written by a Jewish man to Jewish believers in Jesus, but we Gentiles would look at that and say, we have to be familiar with what their upbringing is in order to get the full gravity of what's being said. There's obviously plenty of very good information given to the church as a whole, but understanding the audience is incredibly important. And before I move on to Hebrews, just in case you want to interject, I should throw it to you so I don't dominate this.
Oh, no, no, no. I really like this. And again, what Chris is saying is that we're not saying that application for us as believers, But first of all, when you're studying, we always look at it three ways: observation, interpretation, and then application. What would we observe first? So that's what Chris is saying. Make sure we observe the setting, the writers, or what they are, so we can get a biblical interpretation, understanding the mindset of the writer, so we can make a godly applications to our own life. And that's what we're looking for. As I'm reading the Bible, I'm saying, Lord, I want the applications that'll work for me today. And so if we understand the author, the intent of it, then it really does start making sense to us as how this applies to us today. So go ahead, Chris, into Hebrews then.
Sure, and then Hebrews, imagine just being in a room full of Gentiles early on in the church when it finally went to the Gentiles, and having somebody write a book to you and say, hey, Jesus is greater than the angels. He's greater than the tabernacle. He's greater than the greater than the offerings. He's greater than the priesthood or even the high priest. The Gentiles are looking at each other like, what does that have to do with anything? We don't even know what they're talking about. Gentiles Gentiles would understand that if they began to read the Old Testament. But what the caution to the readers of Hebrews is, don't go back to something that has no power to save you. That being the law was only able to identify that they were sinners, but it could never fix the problem with sin. Instead, you need a savior for that, and you need an offering that God would accept that would really purge you and remove your sin from your account, not just cover it up to have it dealt with later. So the writer of Hebrews is telling this to Jewish understanding, but believers in Messiah, and then telling them, don't waver in what you believe, because going back to what we all know is something that cannot save you. So that's great for the Gentile reader at that point to say there's only salvation in Jesus, even something as wonderful as the law was, because God gave it to them. It still doesn't have the ability to save you because it can't do the one thing that grace through Jesus Christ can, and that is to purge you of your sin, that it's no longer on your account. You don't have to you don't own it any longer, if you will. Your sin has been forgiven, and it's done so through the person of Jesus Christ. Jew and Gentile can understand that, but only from an understanding of the law do you see the importance of it.
Yes. Well, that's true. Even as what you're saying is throughout the whole Bible. Like on Sunday night, told you, Chris, I was teaching Jeremiah. I got to try to put the sandals of Jeremiah during the times and customs and what he's going on there in that time, and try to translate that. How does that apply to us today? And that's what going back and trying to understand is so vitally important for us to fill the setting. Remember, they didn't have an In-N-Out burger out every corner. They didn't, our Western culture per se. And so you try to understand all that they're going through. We have a time for a little bit of James. Chris, I'd like to through this one, and maybe you can, with this understanding, give it to us a little bit, where he says, my brethren, obviously he's speaking to his Jewish brothers at that time, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you might be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Oh, my goodness. What's he talking about there, Chris? So why don't you help us with that one?
Again, this is something that is a little bit hidden from our understanding. If we want to, first of all, know the text itself and the original intent and the original audience, something is being presented to them that is really trying them. There's potentially additional persecution that takes place where they are.
Well, the Romans were marching into town, and I mean, it was not like, I'm going through trials because all the traffic on Beach Boulevard, was it?
Yeah, especially since if they've been scattered abroad, and let's say that they're outside of Israel, we know that there was a large number of Jewish people who had escaped, believers who had escaped to Damascus. Paul was on his way there in Acts chapter 9 to go and imprison them and bring them back. So let's just use them as an example. I'm sure they were in Alexandria. I'm sure they were in the other places of the Roman Empire, but some were in Damascus. So if that's the case, let's just assume that they're in Damascus. Being a Jew in Damascus couldn't have been an easy thing. So the pressures of living among Gentiles for a Jewish believer in Jesus would have all numbers of real trials to it, difficulties because they're displaced from what they know. And so
Mm.
James says, look, it's not as though God doesn't know that you're there. So count it all joy, because God can use the circumstance that you are in, wherever that is that you are. He can use the circumstances, even if it is intended by people for your bad. God has allowed you to be in that place, and He can work those things out. Be patient and endure, and don't give up hope. Don't become hopeless.
Yes. Yeah. And I love the fact that he says, let patience have its complete work. Otherwise, there's actually the application goes, there's a process going on where God's putting us through this test, stretching us a little bit that we can grow in our faith. I don't know of anybody that likes to go through trials, but the application tells me that, as I move this up to our time, Chris, that we all go through difficulties. He says but the end result is the Lord wants me to be lacking. And He's given us the Holy Spirit to help us through these trials, to help us through this time of testing that we go through. And so that's kind of a little taste of what we want to do. Chris and I want to do. Next week's program is to go back a little bit in the book of James and take a look at it from the first century church, and then how does it apply to us today in our day and ours. I think it's very important that we look at James, because we call it the book of practical Christianity, and that's what we need, is something that we can latch on to and how it could work for our daily living. Chris, do you have any closing comments? Well, we zipped through that program, didn't we?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of what we expect that we're going to do when we get together, you and I. But when I read this passage, or really anything that's in this book, you'll notice, if you've taken the time to read through it, he doesn't have a lot of the pleasantries of kind of patting you on the back and say hello to this guy for me and we greet you and
Yeah.
all. There's none of that, because it's not written to one particular church. It's written to those wherever they are. So it tends to be a little bit on the impersonal side, which really makes it that much more practical, because it's not personal. It's just said, you're living among the Gentiles, you're living amongst a world that doesn't agree with you. How then can you best be a representation of the love of Jesus Christ to a world that doesn't acknowledge Him? And it's just a really fascinating book.
Yeah. Well, next week, as we gather together, Chris is going to answer a question that we all have. What do we do when we lack wisdom? How do we, what does James have to say? And so we'll be able to look at, like Chris just said, some very practical questions, and he jumps right into it. James does, and we hope that you will invite your friends to tune in to Answers for Today. Remember to check out Chris's website and send us your questions and comments. So on behalf of Chris, I'm Terry. May God richly bless you. Bye-bye now.